This is the music of Gimmick, a 1992 NES classic by Sunsoft and one of my favorite games of all time. Gimmick is a fascinating title. Its notoriously difficult platforming makes perfecting Yumetaro's physics and movesets feel rewarding. The game brilliantly balances good level design with challenging platforming, making the game feel fair despite being so difficult. Traversing each level with Yumetaro's star feels exhilarating. Avoiding all the meticulously placed enemies and obstacles and reaching that exciting final boss never gets old. I keep finding myself returning to Gimmick despite knowing everything the game has to offer, because it's just that fun to play through. However, more than the gameplay, one aspect I find myself most fascinated with is its music. Its soundtrack sounds like no other. Its complex polyphonic melodies and use of chords are something you rarely hear from music of the NES era. If you know anything about Gimmick, you've probably heard of the Sunsoft 5B. This revolutionary sound chip is well known for being packed in with the Famicom release of the game. The Sunsoft 5B added 3 extra sound channels to the already existing 5, allowing the composer much more flexibility in composing for the NES. But this isn't the sole reason why the soundtrack excels as well as it does. Sunsoft is known for pushing the technical capabilities of the NES's hardware and overcoming the challenges due to its limitations. Sunsoft is most deserving of praise, especially when it comes to their music, and this can most definitely be said about Gimmick. So with all this in mind, let's take a deep dive into the wondrous world of Mr. Gimmick's music and explore what makes it so great. For this first part, I'm going to briefly cover the audio capabilities of the NES, however you can skip to the timestamp on screen if you already understand how it works. The Nintendo Entertainment System's audio processing unit came with many technical limitations. The biggest and most glaring limitation are the 5 sound channels, each channel only capable of producing one fixed type of waveform or signal. The first 2 channels are a pair of pulse waves, followed by a triangle wave, a noise channel, and a sample channel. I'm going to use the main theme to The Legend of Zelda to demonstrate what the waves look like. The first 2 pulse waves, seen here, were commonly used for melodic lines and accompaniment, as they were the most versatile to work with. The pulse wave has 4 different pulse widths, each producing a unique sound. This was done by changing the on and off ratio of the pulse wave, essentially when the pulse wave was active or not, which gives the illusion of different sounding instruments. The pulse width here is 50%, you can see how the on and off ratio are the same width apart. The triangle wave, comparatively, is much different than the pulse wave. It moves in a staircase-like pattern and has no volume control. This was commonly used for bass lines as the lack of volume control made it preferable. The noise channel produced random frequencies, which resulted in a noisy sound, like TV static, and this was largely used for percussion instruments. The percussion was made by changing the volume and pitch of the noise, allowing composers to create a simple drum pattern. And finally, the sample channel, capable of using a 1-bit sound file. These incredibly compressed wave files were often percussion samples, the most infamous example being the bongos and timpani in Super Mario Bros. 3. It was possible to create melodic lines using this sample channel, but it was notoriously difficult to work with, as we'll discuss later. From a composer's perspective, it was certainly difficult to work around the limitations of the hardware. One major obstacle in particular was the inability to create full chords using the 2 pulse waves. A common workaround composers utilized was the use of very quick arpeggiation, giving the illusion of a chord.
Back then, game music was mostly done with arpeggios. I felt that the simplicity made it boring. You can't create an awesome sounding chord without using all 4 channels. If you do, you won't be able to have any other sounds playing at the same time.
Looking into NES music, it's obvious the inability to create proper chord accompaniment was a huge drawback. And while some NES composers stuck with it and created some phenomenal pieces of art, Masashi Kageyama was having none of it.
I wanted to break the existing Famicom channels. My goal was to take what people generally consider to be the sound of the Famicom and kick it up a notch.
These quotes are from Masashi Kageyama, Gimmick's main composer and the mind behind its amazing soundtrack. When composing Gimmick's soundtrack, Kageyama's goal was to create good music for the next generation to listen to. He composed keeping in mind that video game music might be a kid's first experience with the art form. While the unsuccessful release of Gimmick tells us there probably weren't many kids who got to experience the music of Gimmick, I believe the vision Kageyama had when composing helped guide him to create this amazing piece of art. Kageyama himself describes Gimmick's soundtrack as a compilation of video game music, and considering the soundtrack ranges from fusion and acid jazz to upbeat pop melodies and even all the way to hard rock, it most certainly feels that way.
The music of Mr. Gimmick features ad-libbed portions, a product of jazz and fusion. Those aren't styles people normally hear. That's why I took it upon myself to incorporate them into the soundtrack. I can listen to hit music and songs that have sold well wherever I go, but I don't often get the chance to hear jazz and fusion. I think that's the reason I opted to put their essence into my own songs.
The styles Kageyama was going for in Gimmick's music featured sounds that weren't normally heard on the NES. For example, the jazz chords he wanted to produce just wouldn't work with only 2 pulse waves. Creating music that sounded like an ensemble of multiple instruments just wasn't possible using 5 audio channels. This is where the Sunsoft 5B comes in, a chip created in 1991 and was used in the development of Gimmick. The Sunsoft 5B isn't its own chip, rather it's an almost identical offshoot of Sunsoft's FME7 chip. The difference between the two is that the 5B contained a Yamaha 2149F audio chip embedded within the 5B, allowing for added audio capabilities the FME7 didn't have. The FME7 was used in many of Sunsoft's games, but the 5B and its added audio capabilities was only ever used in Gimmick. I assume that considering the SNES was 2 years into its lifespan by the time Gimmick released, the chip never got a chance to be used again. Nonetheless, the added audio capabilities of the 5B gave Kageyama much more flexibility when it came to composing Gimmick's music. The Sunsoft 5B came with 3 extra audio channels, them being pulse waves, meaning there were 5 of them in total. With how versatile the pulse waves are, these 3 extra channels added a significant amount of depth to the music of Gimmick. For example, Kageyama utilized the extra pulse waves to create full chords without needing to arpeggiate them. In Good Weather, the song played in Gimmick's second stage, you can see how each pulse wave is playing in harmony to create the sound of a full chord. The track Long Tomorrow, used for the final boss fight in Gimmick, sounds like an 8-bit hard rock performance. This is thanks to the ability to utilize the different pulse wave widths, which allows for the sound of different instruments. The first 2 pulse waves have a width of 12.5%, while the bottom 3 have a width of 50%. This creates the sound of 2 distinctly different guitars playing, which would be hard to achieve without the extra pulse waves. Not only that, it has a killer solo part, making it one of the most exhilarating songs in the game. Compared to other NES soundtracks, the Sunsoft 5B makes a huge difference to the sound of Gimmick's music, but it's not the only factor in its uniqueness. Another important aspect to Gimmick's music are the techniques utilized by the sound team at Sunsoft.
Sunsoft always had the ambition to create sounds that no game company had made before. We were the first to experiment with many ideas. For example, we experimented with combining triangle waves and noise waves to make a drum sound, or we'd try using samples for bass lines. From my perspective as the composer, the sound programmers at Sunsoft then were like artisanal craftsmen with awe-inspiring abilities.
This quote is from legendary Sunsoft composer Naoki Kodaka. He didn't work on Gimmick himself, however, he highlights the work culture seen within Sunsoft's sound team. The sound programmers who worked on Gimmick's soundtrack undoubtedly played a huge role in how it turned out. Kageyama himself cites the sound programmers at Sunsoft and specifically Naohisa Morita in playing a huge part in making the soundtrack even work on the NES. When looking into techniques Sunsoft utilized in their music and comparing it to Gimmick, it feels almost as if Gimmick's soundtrack is an accumulation of all the techniques they've developed over the years. One technique I want to highlight in particular is the use of the sample channel to create bass lines. This technique is one that Sunsoft often employed in their music, so much so that I see it referred to as the Sunsoft Bass online. In Gimmick, this technique was used extensively in almost every track. The significance of this is that it's notoriously difficult to work with. You'd think that programmers can use multiple sampled notes and string them together, but you have to keep in mind that this is on the NES. The ROM space required would make it incredibly difficult to achieve. Fortunately, there is a workaround. Composers were able to create melodic lines by repitching sampled notes. So, by consecutively repitching a note one after another, you can make a melodic line. Sounds simple, right? Is what my innocent little baby brain thought when first researching this, but there's a lot more to it than just that. You see, the samples could only be pitched lower, there was no way to pitch them up. This meant you had to make the highest pitched notes of the melodies be the samples, which is relatively simple, right? But there were only 16 available pitches including the original, and these pitches did not descend chromatically. Because altering the pitch of the sample worked by slowing it down, you couldn't simply slow it down by a semitone. Instead, you'd get gaps between the notes, gaps of varying amounts. Say you have a sample note of middle C. Instead of descending down to B and then B flat and so on like you'd imagine, the actual descent would go Sound programmers would work around this by using 5 or more samples on different notes that would be arranged and pitched down to the notes they needed, which takes a lot of time and work to pull off. Yet, despite all the difficulties, they just make it work, and its utilization in Gimmick's soundtrack is incredible. There are many more techniques utilized within Gimmick's soundtrack, but I won't cover them all in this video. Something I do want to point out though is that while the triangle wave is often used as a percussion instrument, in the tracks Good Night and Sophia Take 2, the triangle wave is actually used to create a melodic line. It's vibrato voicing thanks to the way the triangle wave is shaped, and sounds pretty awesome when it's used this way. Gimmick's soundtrack works in wondrous ways. Its music, as well as the entire game, is truly a technical marvel for the NES. It's one of the reasons why I consider it to be one of my favorite games of all time. From its gameplay to its gorgeous graphics to its music and all the way to the creation of this video, Gimmick has been an experience I'll never forget. And to Kageyama, I can confidently say that you've achieved your goal, because even after all these years, your music touches the heart and souls of many of us. If you know anything about this game, then you've probably heard of the re-release called Gimmick Special Edition, releasing in July 6th. And unlike the original PAL release for the game, this will contain the full soundtrack in all its beautiful glory. And if you'd like to learn more about Gimmick as a whole, I highly recommend watching a video by Hayden Loves Anime, The Untold Story of Mr. Gimmick. It discusses Kageyama's experience working with the game's director, and also covers in great detail what Gimmick is all about, so check it out if you haven't. Hayden was also the voice of Kageyama in my video, and they have a very special message for you gamers.
My name is Masashi Kageyama, and I want you to subscribe to Mr. Beast.